Shalom and welcome everyone to the ICEJ webinar series. I'm David Parsons, Vice President and Senior Spokesman for the International Christian Embassy Jerusalem, coming to you from our Jerusalem headquarters. We're now, I think, at about day 104 of Israel's war with Hamas in Gaza. And we're going to take a look today at just how much damage the IDF has done to Hamas in this time period. And can we start saying that Hamas is defeated, it's on the ropes? Is it inevitable, or is there still a lot to do? To help us analyze this, we have our friend Lieutenant Colonel in the IDF Reserves, Jonathan Conricus. For many years, he served as international spokesman with the IDF. Before that, he had served in the Givati Brigade. And he's since he retired, he's been a security analyst with the Israel Defense Security Forum, other groups, recently appointed as a senior fellow with the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies out of Washington, D.C., a very well-respected conservative think tank there. And good to see you, Jonathan. Let's make clear from the start, you finished up several weeks in the IDF spokesman's office at the start of this war, but now you're back in your civilian clothes and on your own can say a little more.
Exactly, David, and I'm very happy to be here, and I thank you for having me on your show.
Always great to have you. You're a wealth of information and insights. We're trying to determine, how close is the IDF getting to defeating Hamas in Gaza? We're expecting after 3, 4, 5 months, maybe by March or so, a lot of the heavy fighting in Gaza would be over. The IDF itself, Chief of Staff Herzi Halevi, and other senior IDF figures, not just the spokesman's office, has said, look, you have operational control over most of northern Gaza. There's even drawdowns of troops. I think one of the 5 divisions in Gaza is being taken out for some R&R and retraining. And so how far along are you to defeating Hamas? How much longer is it going to take to get this job done?
Yes, that's probably a question that a lot of people are asking in Israel and around the world. And like many things in life, the answer is complex and indecisive. My answer would be that I'll divide it into a few parts. One part is that I think that the IDF, there's a mirror image, I think, between the tremendous and tragic failure of the IDF on October the 7th, which is something that the IDF will have to repent and amend for with regards to the Israeli people and the fact that Hamas was able to get in and to butcher as many Israelis as they did, sadly. And that is something that the IDF, being a serious and transparent and honest organization, will have to look deeply into, fix, and make sure that the state of Israel, and most importantly, the people of Israel, will be able to trust it to do its job again in the future. But I see a mirror image between the horrible failure of October the 7th and how the IDF has been operating in the battlefield, fighting against Hamas in Gaza ever since. And I think that troops, both in the Air Force and ground forces, have been fighting admirably in a very challenging combat environment, perhaps, and I say this with caution, but perhaps the most complex combat environment that any Western military has faced ever, because the dimensions of warfare are sky, ground, and underground. And the Gaza Strip, to begin with, even before we speak about the underground, is one of the most densely populated areas in the world, which is really a playground for a terrorist. It offers so much protection and concealment and excellent positions for a terrorist or a militant, if you want to call them that, but most of them are terrorists. And it is a very challenging area to operate for a mechanized and regular military. And that's without talking about the tunnels. And despite the fact that the IDF's enemy is embedded within the civilian population, and Hamas uses civilians and all of the civilian infrastructure hiding behind it, and is embedded within it, and it makes it very difficult for the IDF to distinguish between combatant and non-combatant. Despite all that, and despite the fact that Hamas has this tremendous hundreds of miles and very complex and at the high level of sophistication tunnel system that they've been using to launch attacks at Israel, to fire rockets at Israeli civilians, and to plan and execute attacks against Israeli troops inside Gaza. Despite all of these things, the terrain, the tunnels, the civilians, and the enemy, I think that the IDF has been doing and is doing a tremendous job at dismantling Hamas and its military infrastructure with a minimal impact on non-combatants in Gaza. Yes, there are civilians that have been killed that probably were not part of fighting, but I think that given the almost impossible situation that Hamas has rigged on the ground, the IDF has been doing a very good job. Sadly, on a very, very important mission that the IDF has to return Israeli hostages, the IDF has not yet been as successful as we would have wanted to be. And there are still more than 134, depending on the information that we have, the latest updates about Israeli hostages, but more than 130 Israelis are in Gaza in Hamas captivity. Some of them probably confirmed dead, some of them presumed dead, and some of them probably alive. And that is a situation that surely we wouldn't have imagined that we would be in 100 days after the war started. And we want to be in a different situation. We want all of the Israelis to be brought back home, and we want Hamas dismantled, and we want to start building the future of southern Israel and Israel again. And sadly, we are not there yet. Good progress, as you said, has been made in northern Gaza. The IDF has dismantled most of Hamas's infrastructure there. At least 11, perhaps 12 out of 12 Hamas battalions in the north have been rendered out of commission. There are still squads of terrorists there, and they still have rocket launchers, but all in all, I think a very good achievement. Lots of terrorists have been killed. We're talking about at least 8,000 according to IDF assessments, which may change, but this is the number we're speaking about now. Lots and lots of weapons uncovered and destroyed. Dozens of miles, if not hundreds of miles already in the north of tunnels that have been exposed, researched, and destroyed. Some of those tunnel networks have been massive, that could accommodate vehicles, pickup trucks inside them, specifically in the northern part of the Gaza Strip. So in the north, we're talking about good, solid military achievements, not mission accomplished yet, but good achievements. In the center and in the south, the IDF is still hard at work. Lots of troops are still inside the Gaza Strip, operating, fighting the enemy, fighting above ground and underground, and dismantling bit by bit Hamas infrastructure, which is, again, as I said, very much embedded within the civilian infrastructure in Gaza. There's hardly a house, a school, or a clinic that Israeli troops get to without exposing a tunnel shaft or hidden weapons, hidden explosives, or some other, or a rocket launcher, which Israeli troops have found in kindergartens and in schoolyards and in schools and in mosques and close to churches. All of that has happened, and the IDF continues to dismantle their infrastructure. Now, when we look ahead and we think, okay, let's try to put a time frame on this, I suggest not to put a time frame, because it is very difficult to assess how long this will take and what achievements will be needed in order to defeat the enemy. Defeating an enemy is breaking his will to fight. That is really the essence of defeating an enemy, and that's not something specific to Israel. That is how wars are fought and won all over the world. Once you're able to defeat the enemy's will to fight, once you're able to break that, then you have effectively defeated. And that may take time. And it's a cumulative effort of killing operatives, killing commanders, taking away their most important assets, their logistic capabilities, their administrative capabilities, their fighting capabilities, and of course, killing seniors, and international pressure, and psychological warfare, and media warfare, and many things combined. And it's difficult to say when and how exactly that will be achieved, but I have very high confidence that it will be achieved by Israel, and hopefully, of course, sooner rather than later. As we're speaking, Israeli forces are very much hunting senior Hamas terrorists. Sorry, not Khaled Mash. Well, maybe him also, but he's outside of Gaza, so I won't speak about him so much. But definitely Yahya Sinwar, Mohammed Def, and many other senior terrorists who have not only an operational importance, as in running operations by Hamas against Israel and killing Israelis, but also a symbolic value. And they are targeted relentlessly. Hopefully, Israel will be able to strike them and take them out as soon as possible. So to summarize this opening question of has Hamas been defeated and how long will it take? Good, solid progress has been made, but the job is not yet done. And there's many more terrorists to kill, many more rocket launchers to take out, many more weapons depots to take out and destroy, and many more tunnels to destroy, and seniors to kill before the IDF will be able to declare or sense that the IDF will have defeated Hamas.
Okay, thank you for that very good overview. Look at 100 days. Israeli leaders, the political leaders sort of, said this marks so much. Here's the progress made, the IDF as well. It came amid some of the Israeli military statements that we have operational control, we're drawing down forces, and it was almost like the Israeli media and public took like the fighting's over. We're moving to phase 3 or whatever. They had to then make clear, look, there's still a lot to do in central and southern Gaza. On the Hamas side and their backers in Hezbollah and Iran at 100 days said this, they still declared victory, even with all of Hamas's losses, that the fact that Hamas has fought and stood up to the IDF for 100 days, they consider this a victory. If the war ended today, it may be sort of a draw, but they're going to claim victory just by the fact they've survived so far. This is the problem you face in this region, isn't it?
It is true, and Israel cannot accept anything short of a decisive, clear, and ringing victory. And it needs to be decisive. It needs to be very clearly understood by what's left of Hamas outside of Gaza and all of the other terrorist organizations, all of the other Iranian proxies that are threatening Israel. Because if there is no clarity, then some joker from Tehran or some terrorist from Lebanon might say that Hamas won just because there's still 3.5 Hamas fighters holed up in some bunker somewhere in Khan Yunis or in Rafah. We cannot accept that, and there needs to be a very clear and decisive victory, and there will be one. It may take time, but at the end of this, the only thing that's keeping the IDF from achieving that very fast is the fact that Hamas is using the Gazan civilians as human shields, and that these civilians are not allowed to go out of Gaza. Had they been allowed to evacuate themselves into safety outside of Gaza to Egypt, then this battle would have been much faster and would have had a lower price in casualties and civilians being hurt. But the political reality is that Egypt isn't accepting any Palestinian refugees, and they're stuck inside, and therefore the pace of operations is accordingly. But I don't think that, of course, the Iranians, they don't care anything about Palestinian civilians being killed, but that is really the only thing that is protecting Hamas who are cowards, hiding underground in their tunnels, firing rockets from their tunnels, and barely showing their faces above ground. Whenever they do, they're usually killed. It'll take some time, but at the end of the process, they will be taken out. But when we speak about Israeli force posture, I think we have to zoom out a bit and look at the regional picture and understand that today Israel is actively fighting on at least 3 fronts: Gaza, Lebanon, and Judea and Samaria, with other fronts further away, a naval area of operations and operations in the sky further away from Israel, or aerial operations further away from Israel. And we have to take into account that when Israel thinks about its combat strength inside Gaza versus the other missions that Israel has or may have in the future, then that is how we should understand any rotation in troops inside Gaza being taken out. Nobody in the IDF thinks that the fighting is over in Gaza. The fact that there's rotation is in order to prepare for the next stage of operations and for other missions, and to be able to retain what we call operational flexibility, to be able to respond to different events and to project force as needed according to strategic needs. And maybe some Israelis have been confused, maybe there hasn't been clear messaging, but that is also part of fighting, because whenever the Israeli defense establishment, the spokesperson, etc., communicates with the Israeli public in Hebrew, the enemy is listening as well. And we don't want to share information with the enemy that will be beneficial for them any more than we have to in order to inform the Israeli public. So it's a delicate balance, but I think that at the end of the situation, it's important to take troops out, rest, rearm, train, and reorganize to be ready for future assignments, which may be all over our borders and may be against different enemies.
Yeah, it's this tension over the pace of the war, of getting the job done quickly versus the caution because of the tunnel challenges and everything. But there were Prime Minister Netanyahu was just quoted in the media. I think he was talking to some of the regional council heads who want to go back to their communities on the Gaza border. And he said, look, this war may last not only through this year, but even into 2025. Are there some aspects of this conflict that where you might project it out that long?
That's the first time I hear such a sinister assessment. And one would hope that the Israeli defense establishment would make swifter work of Hamas, at least, and first and foremost Hamas, so to allow Israeli civilians to go back to their homes and start the long and challenging process of rebuilding their communities. There's almost 20 Israeli communities that have been evacuated, some of them are totally ruined, and there will have to be a tremendous reconstruction effort in order to bring these communities back to life. And the precondition, of course, is security. Without security, none of that will happen. And once security is achieved, it will take a lot of effort and a lot of time, and a lot of funds and energy will be needed. But I have complete, belief in the spirit of Israelis, in the spirit of these kibbutz members and other communities who, once the situation will be safe from a security point of view, will go back, demolish what needs to be demolished, and then rebuild stronger, better, more, and larger than how their communities were before. But this, when you look at the sad situation whereby there are almost 200,000 internally displaced Israelis, those are the official figures, and I think that the actual figures are perhaps higher than that. But when you combine evacuees from the north and evacuees from the south, we're looking at a sizable percentage of the Jewish population in Israel. And I would say that that is a non-negotiable situation from an Israeli point of view. Israelis must go back to their homes. And it is a responsibility of the government and the military to facilitate the conditions for them to be able to do so. And every day that the Israelis are not in their homes is a travesty. And Israelis must go back to their homes and populate their communities in the north and in the south. And in the north, I think that the challenge is even bigger because we're facing an even more vile and powerful enemy with more weapons, with longer range, more sophistication, and more personnel to fight against Israel. And what Israel needs to do is to get Hezbollah away from the border to begin with, and then think about, strategically speaking, how to dismantle Hezbollah's capabilities, how to deny Hezbollah the ability to store rockets and fire at Israeli civilians. There's a lot on the list, but at the end of the day, first and foremost, Hezbollah needs to be pushed away from the border so that Israeli communities are safe to return to. I know that is a priority, and it must remain a priority for the government to make sure that that happens and does so very quickly.
Mm-hmm. So to declare the defeat of Hamas or Israeli victory at the same time, you have to restore the sense of security of those Israeli communities on the Gaza border as well as on the northern border, which is going to take some time. As you said, you break the will of the enemy, in this case of Hamas, to fight. Jonathan, this goes beyond the normal concept of deterrence, where they have weapons and they've got motivation and willing to fight, but you put up such a threat against them that it deters them from striking at you. But you're talking about going on beyond that in order to meet this definition of defeating Hamas.
Correct. And that is what's necessary, because we've seen that the enemy we face in Gaza is a genocidal enemy that is indoctrinated to, if they can, conduct a genocide of Jews in Israel, nothing less. And this has been said before October the 7th and after October the 7th by various Hamas seniors inside Gaza and outside of Gaza. This is the essence of Hamas. And perhaps Israel wasn't paying attention before, or perhaps wasn't taking the threat seriously, but I think now we do. And therefore, it is clear that this is not going to end with, a half-cooked political, diplomatic solution to it, whereby Hamas is allowed to continue to exist. That cannot be, because that would effectively be a defeat for Israel. This can only end with a totally defeated and disintegrated Hamas that does not govern the Gaza Strip, that has no military capability, and where Israel establishes full control and operational freedom over the Gaza Strip in order to really clean out all of the remains, all of the weapons, the manufacturing capabilities, the stockpiles and the tunnels, etc., and then to start rebuilding, hopefully together with positive countries and forces in the region, to start rebuilding Gaza while still dominating from a security point of view and making sure that there's absolutely no threat or no resurgence of any enemy capabilities. Until that is achieved, this war will not be over. And we need to be very clear of who we're tolerance against such an enemy could be. I think that there should be no tolerance, and that we must achieve a very overwhelming, clear, and complete decisive victory here that leaves no doubt, and no military threat emanating from Gaza in the foreseeable future. And that takes a lot of fighting. And you're correct in saying that, we're not talking about deterring someone from action. We're talking about really dismantling their ability to fight and also their will to fight. Now, we have to distinguish between that which can be measured in military terms, in terms of dismantling their military abilities, and the idea of fundamental Islam and extremism and jihad against Israel. Those ideas, unfortunately, will not be evaporated once Hamas is destroyed. Those ideas will sadly continue to exist. They are harbored by many Muslims around the world, and it will take I don't know, hundreds of years to eradicate that, if at all. But we're now focusing on Hamas and on dismantling their capabilities. Sadly, violent extremist Islam will be around even after Hamas is dismantled.
Yeah, I wish and pray the world would understand the tough work and hard work and risky job that Israel is undertaking to do this on behalf of the the rest of us. Just another question on the hostages. I know it's it's got to be frustrating that the Israeli military has been fighting and fighting since that 1 week truce where they got almost half the about 100 hostages back, but none since. It looks like there's a pattern that as soon as you get close to some, they may be executing some of these. And now we've got the 1 year birthday of the little Kafir Bibas child. But the IDF says we need to keep the military pressure on in order to get these hostages back. Why is that the key to getting them back?
Because otherwise Hamas doesn't have an incentive to do so. And unless there is continuous, heavy, relentless, and painful pressure on Hamas, on their leaders, on their terrorists, on the fighters, on their infrastructure, their houses, their belongings, and their hideouts, etc., unless there is that clear pressure, then why would they? Then they would have the upper hand and they would just drag out things and they could take all the time in the world and dictate all the conditions, and Israel wouldn't be in a really in a very good situation to dictate anything. And that is not where we should be being. And I frankly think that Israel has been, how should I say it, extremely tolerant and very considerate of humanitarian needs in Gaza. I think that many Israelis, I know that many Israelis are asking, including families of hostages, why on earth is there humanitarian aid going into the Gaza Strip every day? Hundreds of trucks. We're talking about more than 200 trucks every day now for the last week. Why is there humanitarian aid going into Gaza while there are, let's say, 135 Israelis being held hostage there? Many people in Israel find that extremely hard to understand and explain. Sure, there's international considerations and there's pressure and there's all kinds of leverage applied on Israel. But at the end of the day, including civilians, women and children, are being held in Gaza for more than 100 days in extremely cruel and inhumane conditions, many of them wounded, women and children and men that were taken in a brutal, unprovoked attack on our sovereign state. Yet, the world continues to turn, and even humanitarian aid is provided to the Gaza Strip. Many people feel that that is not a good situation, and perhaps that the Israeli government should address things differently than how it is doing it now.
I want to ask you about the terror tunnels. We've just had like a briefing from the IDF that they've been more extensive than even the IDF had assessed beforehand. It's over 500 miles of tunnels. I think they said 5,700 entrances, shafts that go down into the tunnels. Nearly every other house has one, schools, hospitals, mosques, etc. But and there was also, they found earlier a tunnel that basically runs north-south along under the main highway, Saladin Highway, from Gaza City down towards Khan Yunis and Rafah. And now they've just found a second one right near Wadi Aza. Is it your understanding that these tunnels could have or did allow Hamas, even while the IDF controlled the ground above, to get weapons, terrorists, senior Hamas leaders, even hostages north and south, from say the north into the south underneath of the IDF over recent weeks?
Yeah, I think that's a very fair assessment and a very high level of probability that that did indeed happen. happen. And I think that it's fair to assume that that did indeed, that is how Hamas used the tunnels. And until the IDF is able to dismantle, either incapacitate them by various ways that Israel has at its disposal, until it's done, the fighting against Hamas won't be done. And Hamas will still have the ability to fire rockets and to come out the day after the fighting and claim victory. So that needs to happen. But some tunnels that are, we've spoken about this, and it's very true. All of the things that you said are very correct. 5,700 and hundreds of miles of tunnels in Gaza. But tunnels that have not yet been spoken about so much and are absolutely strategic are the smuggling tunnels coming in from Rafah into Gaza from Egypt. All of the weapons, I'd say 99% of the weapons in Gaza that were used to butcher 1,200 Israelis on the 7th of October and have been used to fight Israel ever since, including the rockets that are being fired on Israeli civilians almost relentlessly, all of those weapons and explosives came in through Egypt. And they came in through the tunnels. And until Israel will dismantle those tunnels, the war won't be over, because it will just mean that Hamas will have the ability to replenish their capabilities, rearm, and regroup inside Gaza and outside of Gaza, as long as those tunnels are open and intact. So I think that we will see in the not so distant future IDF operations in Rafah, in and under Rafah, in order to take out those tunnels, because without it, the fighting will continue, and it will only be a very short matter of time before Hamas gets more weapons from the Iranians and others and continues fighting. And of course, Israel cannot and must not allow that. So we're looking at coming back to the first question, how we started this. So we will likely see operations in Rafah. And don't worry, I'm not telling anybody here secrets that Hamas doesn't know and understand. Hamas understands this. The IDF knows it. The Egyptians know it. The Americans know it. Everybody understands that this is the case, and that this war will not be over with open tunnels under Rafah. Just informing you and your tremendous viewers around the world that they can anticipate fighting in Rafah, and it is an absolute necessity for Israel, even and despite the fact that there may be a lot of civilians, internally displaced civilians there. They will have to move. They will have to be moved out of that area in order to allow for IDF operations there. And hopefully they will do so quickly without any interference. And then the IDF can get busy at dismantling that. One last thing, perhaps, that I would like to address. This goes back, and it's actually relevant to the church and to Christian welfare people and humanitarians that were active in at the end of the War of Independence in 1948 and 49. I suppose that you know where I'm going with this. I'm speaking about UNRWA. UNRWA, the UN Works and Relief and Works Organization in Gaza, which started out as a nice enough organization to care for displaced Arabs that were unfortunate victims of the Arab aggression against Israel in 1948. That institution was founded more than 75 years ago, and today that institution, according to my assessment and many others, is perhaps the biggest obstacle to reconciliation, peace, and justice with regards to Israel and the Arabs, and specifically Palestinians. And when we look at the situation in Gaza, I do not think that there can be a just and lasting and sustainable solution to the suffering in Gaza, the instability and the violence and the extremism, as long as UNRWA is allowed to continue to exist and de facto run and operate and manage the Gaza Strip, including schools, hospitals, and provision of food and services. until that organization is phased out and replaced by domestic Arab Palestinian organizations and entities and functions, we will not see stability, we will not see peace, we will not see justice, and most importantly, we will not see an end to the conflict between Israelis and Arabs, and specifically in Gaza.
Yeah, point well taken. UNRWA is not only this organization that teaches anti-Semitism, but jihad.
Yes,
brainwashes to jihad. Yes.
Yeah, brainwashes to jihad and brainwashes small Palestinian children that they have the right of return and that someday they will go back to Yafo and Haifa and Jerusalem, filling their heads with dangerous nonsense that eternalizes the conflict and is very dangerous for them and dangerous for Israelis. The sooner this organization is, responsibly shut down, downsized, and then shut down, and then other
phased out.
Yeah, phased out. Thank you. That's the word I was looking for. It needs to be phased out responsibly, and then for other Palestinian institutions to take its place. Only when that happens will we see real strategic long-term change for the better for the people in Gaza.
Okay, you mentioned not only going into the Rafah area, the southern end of the strip, but the Philadelphia corridor, which is right on the border with Sinai. I mean, there's sensitivities between Israel, the IDF, and Egypt on this, but the point you made is that all the massive amount of weapons that Hamas had into Gaza, it just shows Egypt, when they said they had shut down those tunnels, it just wasn't the case. And only the IDF has the motivation to go in there and really root them out. This seems to be the case, but that's a whole new operation that's coming, but it's complex because all those civilians have been pushed south. Where are you going to send them? Are you going to send them to some of the areas that have been covered in southern or central Gaza? Are you going to would Israel let them back into the north? Because that carries all kinds of risks as well.
Yeah, I think the best solution, as far as I can understand it, is, again, with respect for the sanctity of human life, with respect for the fact that people who are not part of Hamas and not combatants should not be affected by the warfare. And this is what the IDF has been aspiring to achieve all along. And this has been the guiding principle for Israeli operations. This is why Israel called on Palestinians to evacuate northern Gaza ahead of the Israeli ground maneuvers there, simply to get them out of harm's way. Sadly, Hamas didn't allow people to do so, and UNRWA actively worked against Israel in order to save these people and get them out of the areas, and UNRWA refused to build the humanitarian zone and proper refugee or IDP housing in the humanitarian zone that the IDF organized. And I think that's very sad. That is so cynical and so sad. And Israel will have to find solutions for that. Hopefully, the humanitarian zone will be erected and furnished, and supplies will be brought there, and shelter, water, sanitation, medical, and food, etc., to that area, so that Palestinians can be temporarily evacuated from there to the Muassi area, just northwest of Khan Yunis. And then they would be there until the fighting is over, until Hamas is defeated, and then slowly they could return and start rebuilding. The best would, of course, be if they would be allowed out to Egypt. Yeah, and of course that would be the safest for them, but I understand the political considerations of the Egyptians. They seem to care very little about the suffering of Palestinians and more about other things, but those are their considerations. And at the end of the day, if we want to minimize the harm to civilians, then they should be taken out of the active combat areas, and there are solutions. If humanitarian organizations and UN entities in Gaza will cooperate with Israel and work together and facilitate the proper construction of that humanitarian zone, then many civilians can be saved and a lot of suffering can be spared. If they won't, and if they'll continue to de facto support and sustain Hamas rule over Gaza by making it more difficult for Israel to fight against Hamas, then there will be more suffering. At the end of it, Israel will obtain whatever goals we need anyhow. And the question is, how many people will suffer on the way? Israel will continue to operate according to the laws of armed conflict, will continue to distinguish between combatant and non-combatant, and to apply the principle of proportionality, operate according only when there is military necessity, and to use force only where needed and applicable. But it is a war. And people who are in a war zone, unfortunately, can and most likely, sadly, will be hurt. And of course, that needs to be prevented to a minimum. And hopefully, international institutions will help instead of obstruct in saving Palestinians.
Yeah. We want to start winding up now, but when all the aid is coming in through the Rafah crossing, it's been inspected by Israel, these trucks going in. It looks like Hamas still has a fairly firm control there in that southern part of Gaza because they grab these trucks of aid and hoard it for themselves and then sell it they either just keep it for themselves or they sell it on the black market at a much elevated price when the international community gave it for free. And if the IDF goes in and takes over the Rafah crossing, there's sensitivities with Egypt about that. Is that going to break that Hamas grip over the civilians in Gaza there who want food but are being actually extorted at exorbitant prices by Hamas just to get food and water?
Yeah, the cynicism knows no boundaries, and I think the true colors of Hamas are really shining through. We see that they don't care about the needs of the population. They will prioritize their own organizational survivability, their commanders, their combatants, the terrorists themselves, and just their wealth and well-being over the needs of Palestinian civilians any day of the week. And we see that again and again, and the practices that you described, we see them, and they're documented in international and Arabic media. It's not something that Israel is only claiming, but you can see it. Social media, you can see Palestinians saying it for themselves. Why are Hamas stealing aid? Why, when I'm supposed to receive food and water and medicine from the international aid, why do I have to buy it for tremendously high and grotesque prices? Why? Because Hamas prioritizes it. I'm not sure, regarding your question, I am not sure that this will solve the issue totally. As long as there will be Hamas operatives and a Hamas administrative system in Gaza, these practices will continue. And even if Israel will control one side of the Rafah crossing, I'm sure that once the aid convoys go into other parts of Gaza, other parts of southern Gaza where Israel may not yet dominate above ground, there it will be commandeered or stolen by Hamas, and the same practice will continue. So it's more a matter of A, calling it out, B, demanding from UN entities that they do a much better job at protecting the commodities, protecting the aid, doing their job at making sure that the aid is received directly without Hamas middlemen to the civilians in need. And third, in the future, to once Israel establishes control, to make sure that it is indeed administered directly and freely as intended.
Yeah. Last question. How concerned are you that a lot of Hamas militiamen may have fled south with all those civilians, taken off their uniforms? They're sitting there hiding in their thousands among the civilian population. When all those are allowed to come back, they're going to be right back there trying to control the people and fire and threaten Israel. And what we're seeing in recent days, it looks like the IDF has caught on to one of Hamas tactics. They hid rockets and rocket launchers and weapons in the tunnels and mosques and hospitals, whatever. But in some places, they just buried them in the sand out in fields and open areas, just buried them. They know where they are. The IDF is finding some of these. I think they found 100 rocket launchers in one pile in Beit Lahia, which is up in the north where the IDF's been for months. And I mean, I'm concerned that if all those civilians come back north, there's going to be rockets already hidden there. There'll be guys coming back in with them, that within 2 or 3 days, you're going to have hundreds of rockets fired at Israel.
Yeah, your concerns are not unfounded. And one of the problems with terrorists is that it's a revolving door or sliding door between being a terrorist 1 second and then being a Gazan, a poor Gazan civilian the second. And even appearing on Hamas propaganda, telling sad stories about civilian suffering as a civilian, and then the minute after, in civilian clothing, firing RPGs at Israeli tanks or detonating booby traps against Israeli soldiers. One could only wish, I don't know if the audience here is a fan of Quentin Tarantino movies, but one movie comes to mind. Yeah, I know there's lots of blasphemy, etc., but they may have seen it anyhow, you know, where this squad of vigilante American soldiers, they put something on the foreheads of Nazis. This is, of course, fictional. Yeah, something that they cannot take off. Which is a big swastika embedded within their forehead. I wish, you know, there would be a way of telling terrorists from innocent civilian, but it is extremely challenging. It's based on a lot of intelligence work and a lot of cross-referencing of different sources of information. Israel has a lot of good intel on Hamas, but this will be challenging, and it already is a challenge. And if you look at Hamas videos that they themselves are distributing, you'll see that they fight in civilian clothes. They have a vest on them, a military vest, which can be easily taken off, but the rest is civilian clothes, gym shoes and sweatpants. That's how they fight, and not by mistake. It's not as if they don't have uniforms. They've got lots of uniforms for parades and for their photo ops and for their obituaries. They have very nice looking uniforms, but they are not for fighting, because if you fight in uniform, you'll die in uniform, and then it will be clear to everybody and in the world that this was a Hamas terrorist who was fighting. If not, he can be claimed as a civilian who was unfortunately killed by the Israelis after having done absolutely nothing wrong. So it is a challenge, one that Israel is aware of and will be monitoring. But I think despite that monitoring, it will happen. To conclude, I think where we are now at this point is we're in the early stages of this war. Still a lot of efforts will need to be done. Still a lot of fighting. Still a lot of a heavy price in casualties will, I think, be paid by Israel. But I draw lots of comfort speaking with and hearing from Israeli soldiers on the battlefield, soldiers and commanders who are extremely committed, in high spirit, with devotion, conviction, belief in the justness of their cause, and knowing, not just believing, but knowing that there's no other alternative but victory. Complete, decisive, and clear victory over this very extreme evil that has come upon us and murdered our civilians and raped our women and executed our children and taken our civilians hostage. There is no choice but complete victory over them. And the men and women on the ground fighting understand this, and they're willing to go the 100 and extra miles needed in order to get the job done. And I'm very comforted by that, and I'm proud to be a former member of that organization that fights and wants and will get the job done against Hamas.
Man, we don't want victory to be snatched from Israel's hands by the U.S. or other internet members of the international community. Just got to keep fighting. We want to thank you for your time, IDF Lieutenant Colonel in the Reserves, Jonathan Conricus, who has served for many years, a well-known figure as IDF spokesman, but is back in civilian roles now as a security analyst with the Israel Defense and Security Forum and the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, among other think tanks and analysis groups. Thank you, Jonathan, for all your time and insights and expertise.
Thank you very much for having me, and shalom from Tel Aviv.
Okay, and we want to thank everyone who's joined us today for the ICJ webinar series. Make sure to stay tuned. At the top of the hour at 4 p.m. Israel time, we're going to have our daily global prayer gathering. You can pray with Christian leaders from all over the world. And then we'll see you next week on Thursday at 3 p.m. Israel time, once again, for our ICEJ webinar series. God bless you from Jerusalem.
Thank you for joining us for this informative webinar. Be sure to subscribe to our social media channels or visit our website at icej.org for upcoming webinars and more ICEJ exclusive content.